In the ruins of the world's first cities, carved into clay tablets older than the pyramids, lies a name that still haunts our imagination: the Anunnaki. Were they gods, judges, or something else entirely? For the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, they were the divine forces who shaped destiny itself. For later generations, they became figures of mystery, woven into creation myths, floods, and even the stars above. In this journey, we will walk through 4,000 years of history and myth, tracing the footsteps of the Anunnaki, from their temples in ancient Sumer to their role in Babylonian cosmology, to their echoes in the Bible and their reimagining in modern times. You will see how these shadowy gods defined the first civilizations, how they survived the fall of empires, and why they continue to captivate us today. Stay with me, because what begins in clay tablets and temple hymns becomes a story that has never truly ended, a story about fate, power, and humanity's oldest questions. In the ruins of southern Iraq, archaeologists once unearthed fragments of clay pressed with wedge-shaped signs. These were the first written words in human history, the cuneiform tablets of the Sumerians. On them, etched thousands of years ago, we find stories of strange and powerful beings, the Anunnaki. Today, countless books, documentaries, and conspiracy theories claim the Anunnaki were ancient astronauts, alien visitors from distant stars. But what did the Sumerians themselves actually say about these beings? In this episode, we'll turn away from the modern myths and step back into the ancient world. We'll read directly from the tablets, explore the role of the Anunnaki in Sumerian religion, and uncover how they were understood by the people who first worshipped them. Along the way, we'll see how their story evolved, how they shaped the lives of early kings, and why they remain so fascinating today. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll know exactly what the Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki, and how that differs from the stories told thousands of years later. In the baked earth of southern Mesopotamia, in the land that the ancients once called Sumer, the first experiments with civilization took shape. Along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, small farming villages slowly grew into cities. Here, some of the earliest temples were built, trade routes were laid down, and law, order, and ritual began to take written form. And in this place, more than 5,000 years ago, human beings pressed their thoughts into clay, leaving behind the oldest written records of history. When archaeologists in the 19th century began to excavate these forgotten ruins, they pulled from the dust countless fragments of broken clay tablets, each etched with tiny wedge-shaped impressions. This script, now known as cuneiform, opened a window into the beliefs of the Sumerians. On those tablets, preserved through accident and time, appear some of the first mentions of beings called the Anunnaki. Today, the word Anunnaki has become loaded with speculation. In documentaries and online discussions, it is sometimes claimed that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but extraterrestrial beings who came down from a distant planet to engineer humanity. Such theories have spread widely in popular culture, but they raise an important question. What did the Sumerians themselves actually say about the Anunnaki? To answer that, we must turn away from modern speculation and listen directly to the voices of the ancient scribes who first wrote these myths. The Sumerians believed the world was governed by a great family of gods. At the head of the pantheon was Anu, the god of the sky, who dwelled in the highest heavens. His children were many, and among them were the Anunnaki, a collective name used to describe a group of divine beings descended from Anu. The very word Anunnaki likely means the princely offspring of Anu, or more simply, the children of heaven. On some tablets, they are described as numbering 50. On others, they appear as 7 great judges of the underworld. Their roles are not always consistent, and that inconsistency tells us something important. The Sumerians lived in city-states, each with its own patron deity and local traditions. Stories were told, retold, and reshaped depending on who was writing them down. So when we encounter the Anunnaki in the texts, we are not seeing a single unified doctrine, but rather fragments of a living tradition that changed across time and place. One of the earliest mentions of the Anunnaki comes from myths describing the creation of humanity. In the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian version of older Sumerian traditions, the gods grew weary of their labors. They decided to fashion humans to bear the burdens of work, to farm the fields, dig the canals, and maintain the temples. In this story, it is the Anunnaki who decree humanity's role, shaping the destiny of mankind as servants to the gods. Elsewhere, in hymns and prayers, the Anunnaki appear as a divine assembly, a council of deities who distribute fates. Just as kings and governors ruled the cities of Mesopotamia, so too did the Sumerians imagine a heavenly court where decisions of life, death, and fortune were handed down by the Anunnaki. Their word was binding, their decrees unchangeable. In this sense, they embodied the forces of order and judgment that govern the fragile lives of people living between the rivers. But the Anunnaki were not confined only to the heavens. In other texts, they are described as the chthonic judges of the netherworld. When Inanna, the goddess of love and war, descended into the underworld, she stood before the 7 Anunnaki who sat in judgment. They fixed their gaze upon her, pronounced their sentence, and condemned her to death. Here, the Anunnaki are not beneficent creators, but harsh arbiters of mortality, a reminder of the shadow that lies behind the bright rituals of life. The picture that emerges from these tablets is complex. The Anunnaki were not a single figure, like Zeus or Osiris, but a shifting category of divine beings whose roles changed with context. Sometimes there were many, sometimes few, sometimes celestial, sometimes subterranean. To the Sumerians, this ambiguity was natural. The divine world was vast and layered, and gods could embody multiple aspects without contradiction. So, what did the Sumerians say about the Anunnaki? They said that these were the offspring of heaven, the arbiters of fate, the ones who decreed the order of kingship and judged the souls of the dead. They were not aliens, nor did the Sumerians write of them as visitors from the stars. They were part of the religious imagination of a people who sought to explain the cycles of life, death, and power that governed their existence. It is tempting, from our modern perspective, to read into these myths something exotic or otherworldly. After all, the descriptions can sound strange. The Sumerian Kings List, for example, describes rulers before the Great Flood who reigned for tens of thousands of years. To some, this has been taken as evidence of extraterrestrial manipulation. To the Sumerians, however, these exaggerated reigns were symbolic. They expressed the deep antiquity of kingship, stretching back into a mythic age before history began. The Anunnaki were invoked here as guarantors of authority, lending divine legitimacy to earthly power. Other tablets describe rituals in which offerings were made to the Anunnaki, appealing for fertility in the fields or protection from disaster. Just as humans depended on the gods for survival, the gods themselves relied on offerings and devotion. In this reciprocal relationship, the Anunnaki represented the unseen forces that could either bless or curse human life. And yet, for all their importance, the Anunnaki were not always at the center of Sumerian religion. The people of Uruk looked to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Those of Eridu venerated Enki, god of wisdom and water, while Nippur was the city of Enlil, the great lord of the air. The Anunnaki were part of this divine ecosystem, a collective presence rather than a single ruling power. When we sift through the surviving texts, one theme becomes clear. The Sumerians saw their world as carefully ordered, but precarious. Floods could sweep away entire harvests. Invading armies could reduce cities to rubble. Death was ever present, and the afterlife, as imagined by the Sumerians, was bleak and joyless. In such a world, the Anunnaki served as cosmic judges, enforcers of a divine order that could not be questioned. To live well meant to live within the decrees they had established. It is striking to contrast this with the modern reinterpretations of the Anunnaki. In the late 20th century, writers like Zecharia Sitchin claimed that these gods were in fact extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru. According to his theory, the Sumerian tablets recorded not myths, but actual history, tales of genetic engineering, space travel, and ancient astronauts. But when we return to the original texts, we find none of this. The Sumerians themselves never wrote of Nibiru as a homeworld, nor did they describe the Anunnaki as engineers of human DNA. What they described were gods, beings of power and mystery, rooted in their own worldview, shaped by their environment and culture. The rediscovery of the Anunnaki is a reminder of how fragile the historical record can be. For centuries, these names lay buried, unknown to the world. Only in the last 150 years have we begun to piece them together, tablet by tablet, translation by translation. And yet, from these fragments, we can glimpse something of how the first civilizations imagined their place in the cosmos. So when we ask, what did the Sumerians say about the Anunnaki? The answer is both simple and profound. They said the Anunnaki were the children of Anu, the heavenly host, the arbiters of fate and kingship, the judges of the underworld. They were woven into the fabric of life, death, and destiny. They were not visitors from another world, but reflections of the hopes, fears, and mysteries of the world the Sumerians themselves inhabited. And perhaps this is why the Anunnaki continue to fascinate us. Because in their shifting, ambiguous forms, they embody something universal. Humanity's attempt to make sense of the forces that rule our lives, whether in the fertile soil of ancient Mesopotamia or in the imaginations of those who look to the stars today. If we wish to truly understand the Anunnaki, we cannot rely on fragments of retold legend, nor on the distortions of modern imagination. We must return to the physical tablets themselves, the clay slabs pressed with signs by scribes 4,000 years ago, hardened by accident in fire or preserved beneath the sands of Iraq. Only by examining these ancient texts can we begin to explain how the Sumerians saw their gods and what place the Anunnaki held within their stories. The cuneiform tablets are small and unassuming. Some fit neatly in the palm of a hand. Others are larger, designed to record royal inscriptions, hymns, or temple inventories. To the casual eye, they look like little more than chunks of baked mud. But on their surfaces runs the script of the world's first writers, lines of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the clay with a reed stylus. The language of these earliest texts was Sumerian, a tongue unlike any other we know, a linguistic isolate with no living relatives. When European scholars first encountered these tablets in the 19th century, they faced an immense challenge. The script had to be deciphered, and then the language itself had to be understood. Piece by piece, scholars learned to read Sumerian, and with it, the myths and hymns that revealed the beliefs of a civilization long vanished. Among the most compelling of these were the stories that spoke of the Anunnaki. One of the richest sources comes from mythological narratives such as the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Though some of these works were later written in Akkadian, their roots lay in Sumerian traditions. Within them, the Anunnaki appear again and again as a divine collective, the great gods who determine the fates of both men and rulers. On the tablets describing the descent of Inanna into the underworld, the Anunnaki are presented as stern judges. Inanna, goddess of love and war, ventures into the shadowy realm of the dead. There she passes through 7 gates, stripped of her garments and symbols of power, until she stands naked before the throne of her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. In that moment, the text tells us, the Anunnaki of the underworld sat before her. They fixed their gaze upon her, the gaze of death. They spoke the word against her, the word of wrath. They cried out against her, the cry of guilt. This short passage is one of the clearest depictions we have. It shows the Anunnaki as collective judges, acting together, their words shaping destiny. Inanna is struck dead by their decree, and her lifeless body hangs on a hook. For the Sumerians, death was inescapable, and the Anunnaki embodied that harsh inevitability. Other tablets give us a different perspective. In the mythological texts concerning kingship, the Anunnaki are not judges of the dead, but guarantors of authority. The Sumerian king list, for instance, tells of the earliest rulers who reigned before the flood. Their reigns stretch across impossible lengths of time, some for more than 30,000 years. The king list states, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Here, the Anunnaki are not named directly, but their role is implied. It was they who conferred kingship upon humanity. To the Sumerians, power on earth mirrored the divine assembly above. Just as kings ruled their cities, the Anunnaki ruled the heavens and decreed the shape of history itself. Another striking example is found in the Atrahasis epic. In this story, the lesser gods grow weary of digging canals and maintaining the land. They rebel, casting down their tools and demanding relief from their endless toil. The higher gods convene, among them the Anunnaki, and decide to fashion a new race, humans, who will labor in the gods' place. Clay is mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god, and from this mixture, mankind is formed. The Anunnaki, by their decree, shape the destiny of humanity, not as masters of their own fate, but as servants of the divine order. When scholars translate these passages, a more nuanced picture emerges. The Anunnaki are not one thing, but many. In some stories, they are a group of 7, in others, 50. Sometimes they are celestial, linked to the sky and the heavens. In other instances, they are associated with the netherworld as grim judges of the dead. What ties them together is their collective role as arbiters of power and fate. It is important to recognize that the Sumerians never systematized their mythology into a single, fixed canon. Each city had its own patron deity, and local variations flourished. The temple scribes of Nippur might describe the Anunnaki differently from those of Uar or Uruk. As myths were retold and recopied across generations, their details shifted. The Anunnaki were not a fixed pantheon, but rather a category of divine beings invoked in different ways according to the needs of story and ritual. What is most striking when we examine the tablets is what is not there. Nowhere do we find the Anunnaki described as extraterrestrials. Nowhere do the tablets speak of distant planets, spaceships, or genetic engineering. Those ideas are modern reinterpretations projected onto ancient texts by later readers. What the tablets actually tell us is both more grounded and perhaps more fascinating. They reveal how the Sumerians thought about power, death, kingship, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. Take, for example, a hymn preserved on a tablet from Nippur. In it, the Anunnaki are praised as the ones who fix destinies and establish the ordinances of heaven and earth. These were not beings to speculate about, but powers to be appeased with offerings and ritual. Farmers, merchants, and rulers alike lived under their decrees. To displease the Anunnaki was to risk famine, misfortune, or defeat in battle. Another tablet, inscribed with an incantation, invokes the Anunnaki in a plea for protection. By the names of the Anunnaki, may the evil not approach, may the curse be turned aside. Here, the Anunnaki are called upon as guardians against malevolent forces. Such passages remind us that for the Sumerians, religion was not abstract theology, but daily practice. The gods were present in every act, in planting crops, in offering sacrifices, in crowning kings. The Anunnaki were part of the texture of this religious life, their names invoked in prayer, their judgments feared, their decrees respected. Explaining the Anunnaki through the tablets also sheds light on how myths evolve. Over time, Sumerian traditions blended with those of the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. The Anunnaki continued to appear, but their roles shifted. In some later texts, they are paired with another group of deities called the Igigi. The Igigi were portrayed as younger gods, while the Anunnaki were seen as the great elder ones. This distinction reflected changing theological landscapes, as successive empires reinterpreted older myths for their own purposes. It is through these layers that modern scholars must carefully sift. Each tablet, each broken fragment, must be read not only for what it says, but also for how it fits within a broader and shifting tradition. The work is slow, often uncertain, but the reward is immense, a glimpse into the thought world of one of humanity's first civilizations. So when we speak of Anunnaki Sumerian tablets explained, what we are truly doing is piecing together a mosaic from fragments. Some pieces are clear: the Anunnaki as judges of the underworld, as guarantors of kingship, as determiners of destiny. Others are more ambiguous, their meanings shifting across time and place. What emerges is not a single definitive image, but a layered and evolving set of traditions that reflected the Sumerians' understanding of their world. In the end, the tablets tell us this: the Anunnaki were gods. They were the offspring of Anu, the sky god, a divine assembly whose decrees governed both life and death. Their presence was felt in the coronation of kings, in the judgment of souls, in the cycles of the cosmos itself. They were not aliens, nor were they beings from beyond the stars. They were the product of a profoundly human attempt to understand existence, to explain why power rests where it does, why death comes to all, why the fates of men seem so often beyond their control. And perhaps this is why their story continues to resonate. The Anunnaki remind us that at the dawn of civilization, humanity looked into the vast unknown and saw not only the stars above, but the reflection of its own fears and hopes, cast in divine form. When we ask what the Sumerians believed, we are faced with a practical challenge. Their words come to us not in smooth, continuous manuscripts, but in broken fragments, shattered tablets, often missing their beginnings or endings, copied and recopied across centuries. To reconstruct the story of the Anunnaki, we depend on these fragile remains and on the painstaking translations that scholars have worked through line by line, sign by sign, for more than a century. The Sumerian myths are not myths in the modern sense of a neatly bound collection. They were living traditions, spoken and sung before they were ever pressed into clay. What we now call Sumerian mythology texts are really scattered inscriptions, temple hymns, ritual prayers, fragments of epic tales, and kingly proclamations. From these, translators have worked to piece together a picture of how the Anunnaki were imagined. One of the first translators to tackle these texts was George Smith, an Assyriologist working in the 1870s. He is perhaps most famous for uncovering the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which bears striking parallels to the biblical tale of Noah. Yet Smith and his successors also drew attention to repeated references to the Anunnaki, the offspring of Anu, appearing again and again in the lines of myth. Translations often highlight the ambiguous, almost collective nature of these beings. In one Sumerian poem, the Anunnaki are invoked as the great gods who decree destinies. In another, they are called the judges of the underworld. Depending on context, the word Anunnaki shifts. It could mean a broad host of divine powers, or a smaller council of chthonic deities. This is where the art of translation becomes more than the simple substitution of words. Every cuneiform sign can have multiple meanings. Every broken fragment leaves gaps that must be filled by inference. Translators face choices. Do they render the word Anunnaki as gods, or preserve it in its untranslated form? Do they assume the number of Anunnaki is 7, as in certain texts, or 50, as in others? Each decision shapes the way we read these myths today. Consider the myth known as the descent of Inanna. In the Sumerian original, when the goddess ventures into the underworld, she comes before the Anunnaki of the underworld. Early translations described them simply as the great gods. Later, scholars preferred to keep the original word, preserving the distinct identity of the Anunnaki. This single decision shifts interpretation. If they are gods in general, the story emphasizes Inanna's confrontation with divine authority. If they are the Anunnaki, it stresses her subjection to a specific group of underworld judges whose role was central to Mesopotamian views of death. Another example comes from the Atrahasis epic. In the Akkadian version, we read that after the lesser gods rebelled against their labor, the great gods gathered in assembly. There, the Anunnaki decreed the creation of humans to bear the burden of work. Some translations emphasize the authority of Enki and Enlil, the more personal deities who act within the myth. Others highlight the collective decree of the Anunnaki. Depending on the translator's lens, the story either underscores the will of individual gods or the unalterable judgment of the divine assembly as a whole. The challenges grow sharper when dealing with broken or incomplete texts. Take the Sumerian king list. On its surviving tablets, many lines are fractured, with names and numbers partially missing. The list records rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, before a great flood swept the land. Here, kingship is said to have descended from heaven. While the Anunnaki are not named directly, the divine source of kingship is implied. Some translators choose to note this connection, linking it with other references where the Anunnaki confer power. Others are more cautious, leaving the fragmentary text as it stands. It is through these small interpretive decisions that our understanding of the Anunnaki emerges. Each translation is, in a sense, an argument, an attempt to bring clarity to a mythic tradition that was never perfectly fixed. What then do the translated texts actually tell us? They tell us that the Anunnaki were deeply associated with judgment, destiny, and kingship. They appear as divine judges in the underworld, determining the fate of the dead. They appear as cosmic arbiters, decreeing the order of the universe and the rise of kings on earth. In some hymns, they are praised alongside Enlil and Inanna, as if they were part of a divine court presiding over human affairs. In one translation of a Sumerian hymn to Enlil, the Anunnaki are described as bowing before him, carrying out his decrees. Here, they are subordinate to the high gods, acting as divine functionaries. In another prayer, they are exalted themselves, described as the lords of heaven and earth, who establish ordinances that cannot be changed. The differences between these translations do not mean that one is right and another wrong. Rather, they reflect the fluidity of Sumerian religion itself. Myths were not systematic theology, they were stories and hymns used in ritual contexts. The Anunnaki could be described differently depending on the needs of that context, whether to inspire awe at the underworld, to affirm the legitimacy of kingship, or to provide reassurance of divine order. Modern readers sometimes find this ambiguity frustrating. We want clear definitions. Who exactly were the Anunnaki? Were they 7 gods or 50? Were they celestial or chthonic? But the Sumerian texts resist such clarity. For the Sumerians, the divine world was not bound by rigid categories. It was vast, layered, and often contradictory. The Anunnaki could be both judges of the dead and children of heaven, depending on the story being told. This is why translations must be read not as definitive answers, but as windows into a worldview where fluidity was the norm. The translator's task is to give us access to that world, without stripping away the richness of its ambiguities. When we compare multiple translations of the same text, fascinating differences appear. In Samuel Noah Kramer's rendering of the descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki are presented with capital letters as a distinct group of gods, lending weight to their authority. In other translations, they are described more generically as the great gods of the underworld. To a casual reader, this might seem minor, but for those trying to understand the Sumerians, it matters greatly. The decision shapes whether we see the Anunnaki as a special category of deities or as an interchangeable collective of divine beings. Similarly, in translations of the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are references to the Great Assembly of the Gods. Some translators identify these as the Anunnaki. Others leave the term broader, simply as the gods. The choice reveals how interpretation interacts with the bare clay signs on the tablets. Through this lens, the Anunnaki are not simply mythical beings, but a case study in how ancient traditions are mediated through language, scholarship, and interpretation. Every line we read today has passed through multiple layers. First oral tradition, then Sumerian scribes, then Babylonian copyists, then modern archaeologists, and finally translators who must balance fidelity with readability. It is in this chain of transmission that much of the modern fascination and confusion arises. The myths themselves are rich and symbolic, but once translated, reinterpreted, and popularized, they can take on new meanings far removed from their original context. This is why, in modern times, the Anunnaki have been recast as alien visitors, despite no such description appearing in the ancient texts. The mistranslations or speculative interpretations of a few words can ripple outward, transforming the ancient gods into something they never were. Still, the work of translation remains invaluable. Without it, the Sumerian voice would be lost to time. Through it, we can glimpse how the first urban civilization imagined its place in the cosmos. The Anunnaki, as revealed through translated texts, embody the great concerns of early humanity: who controls fate, who grants kingship, who judges the dead, and why mortality cannot be escaped. So when we speak of Anunnaki Sumerian mythology texts and translations, we are not only talking about the content of the myths themselves, but also about the process through which they have been preserved, interpreted, and handed down to us. We are seeing the Anunnaki through the eyes of both ancient scribes and modern scholars, layered together across millennia. In translations, they become symbols of order, destiny, or the cosmic balance of power. In modern imagination, they have become visitors from the stars. The truth lies in the clay. The Anunnaki, as the Sumerians described them, were divine beings, powerful, mysterious, and deeply woven into the rhythms of life and death. Through translation, we can hear their voices again, echoing faintly across 5,000 years. Among the most enigmatic of all Mesopotamian texts is a work known to scholars as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appears to be a straightforward document, a record of the kings who reigned in Sumer, their cities, and the length of their rule. Yet when read closely, it reveals something stranger, a blend of myth and history, where rulers reign not for decades, but for thousands of years. At the heart of this list lies the presence of the divine, and behind it, the shadow of the Anunnaki. The Sumerian King List survives on multiple clay tablets and inscriptions, some dating back to the early 2nd millennium BCE, though the material it records is far older. It begins in a mythic time before the Great Flood. It tells us that kingship descended from heaven, and from that moment, the right to rule was vested in specific cities. When modern readers encounter these extraordinary reigns, they often ask, what could this mean? Some take it literally, seeing in these figures evidence of supernatural beings, or, as modern alternative theorists claim, the presence of extraterrestrial overlords, the Anunnaki themselves. But when we look at the king list through the eyes of the Sumerians, a different picture emerges. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, numbers were never only about arithmetic. They were symbolic, laden with meaning. To assign a king a reign of tens of thousands of years was to place him outside ordinary human time, to root him in the mythic age when the gods still walked closely with men. It was a way of saying that these early kings ruled with divine sanction, under the gaze and decree of the Anunnaki. The king list does not name the Anunnaki explicitly in its opening lines, but their presence is implied in the very structure of the text. Kingship descended from heaven, and in Sumerian religion, it was the Anunnaki, children of Anu, who fixed the destinies of rulers and ordained the rise and fall of cities. Behind every line of the king list lies the notion that the fates of men are determined by a divine assembly, and that no crown rests upon a mortal head without the consent of the gods. The king list also bears witness to a cataclysm. After recounting the reigns of the early kings, it tells us, "Then the floods swept over." After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven a second time. This passage links the text directly with the flood narratives found in other Mesopotamian myths, such as the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The flood marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Before it, kings were larger than life, their reigns measured in millennia. After it, their rule was counted in more modest spans, closer to human experience. In this way, the king list functions like a bridge between myth and history. It begins in a timeless, divine age, overseen by the Anunnaki. But as it proceeds, the reigns grow shorter, the names correspond more closely with known rulers, and the text enters the realm of real history. By the end, it reads almost like a chronicle, with recognizably human kings ruling recognizable cities. This gradual shift reflects the worldview of the Sumerians themselves. For them, history was not a purely secular record. It was infused with the presence of the gods. Kingship came from heaven. The Anunnaki determined who would reign and for how long. Even as the text moved toward recording actual rulers, the divine remained woven into the fabric of political legitimacy. One of the most striking features of the king list is the way it organizes power. Kingship does not stay in one city forever. It passes from Eridu to Bad Tibera, from Larik to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. After the flood, it moved again from Kish to Uruk, to Uar, to Awan, to Hamatsi, and so on. Each transfer reflects the Sumerian belief that no city could dominate forever. The favor of the gods, and especially the decrees of the Anunnaki, could shift. Political fortune was never permanent. It was always subject to the higher order of fate. This pattern echoes what we see in other Mesopotamian myths. The Anunnaki are repeatedly described as those who fix destinies. In ritual texts, they determine the outcome of events not only for individuals, but for entire cities and empires. The king list, then, can be read as a reflection of this belief. When power passes from one city to another, it is not the result of human ambition alone, but of divine will, a decree handed down by the Anunnaki. It is also significant that the king list begins with the phrase, "Kingship descended from heaven." In the Sumerian imagination, authority was not invented by men, but bestowed from above. Kingship was a divine institution, a sacred order that linked the mortal world to the cosmic. The Anunnaki, as the children of Anu and members of the divine assembly, embodied this connection. They were the guarantors of kingship, ensuring that earthly rule reflected the decrees of heaven. This understanding of kingship had profound implications for Sumerian society. It meant that to rule was not merely to govern. It was to embody divine authority. A king was not a god himself, but he reigned under the sanction of the gods. His legitimacy depended on his ability to maintain order, to honor the temples, to fulfill the decrees of the Anunnaki. If he failed, he risked losing that divine favor, and with it, his throne. For historians, the king list is valuable not only as mythology, but also as a tool for understanding how the Sumerians conceived of their own past. The early, impossible reigns tell us about their view of the mythic age, when the Anunnaki's presence was most immediate. The later, shorter reigns give us glimpses of actual dynasties and rulers, providing a skeletal framework of early Mesopotamian history. Yet even here, myth and history are inseparably intertwined. A king's legitimacy did not depend solely on his deeds, but on his connection to the divine order. To appear in the king list was not just to be remembered as a ruler. It was to be inscribed into the cosmic narrative overseen by the Anunnaki. Modern interpreters have sometimes seized upon the king list as evidence of something extraordinary. They point to the impossibly long reigns, arguing that such numbers must reflect something more than symbolism. Some claim that these kings were themselves Anunnaki, or that they ruled with the aid of alien technology. Such interpretations are popular in conspiracy theories and alternative history circles. But when we read the text in its cultural context, a different picture emerges. The exaggerated reigns are not literal records, but mythic expressions. They place early kings in a sacred time when the divine and human were closer together. They emphasize that kingship itself was of heavenly origin, conferred by the Anunnaki. The king list is not evidence of alien intervention. It is evidence of how the Sumerians understood authority, history, and the divine. In the end, the Sumerian king list reveals as much about human imagination as it does about divine decree. It shows us how a civilization at the dawn of history sought to anchor its rulers in a cosmic framework, legitimizing power through myth. The Anunnaki, as ever, were central to this vision, not as distant beings from another world, but as the divine assembly whose decrees gave shape to human history. So when we speak of Anunnaki and the Sumerian king list, what we are really describing is the intertwining of myth and power. The Anunnaki stand behind the text as unseen arbiters, conferring kingship, shifting fortune, and reminding every ruler that their reign was subject to forces greater than themselves. The king list is both a political document and a theological one, a record of kings and a testament to the belief that behind every throne stood the will of the gods. And perhaps this is why the king list continues to fascinate us. In its strange mixture of impossible numbers and historical names, we see both the mythic imagination of the ancient world and the first attempts at history as we know it. In its lines, the Anunnaki emerge not as alien overlords, but as symbols of order, destiny, and the divine source of power. For the Sumerians, to rule was to participate in a cosmic drama, and the Anunnaki were its silent, eternal judges. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the world was not a random collection of natural forces. It was a carefully ordered cosmos, ruled by gods whose presence was everywhere. The river that flooded each year, the sun that rose unfailingly, the harvest that ripened in the fields, all were understood as the work of divine beings. Among them stood the Anunnaki, a group of deities whose name has echoed down through time. Yet to truly understand the Anunnaki, we must see them not in isolation, but as part of the vast pantheon of Sumerian gods, each with their own stories, roles, and domains. The Sumerians did not think of their gods in abstract terms. They imagined them as personalities, each with strengths, rivalries, and emotions. Their pantheon was as complex as a royal court, full of alliances and conflicts. At the highest level was Un, or Anu, the sky god, the father of the Anunnaki, who embodied the overarching authority of heaven itself. His word was law, his presence vast and remote, a reminder that the order of the cosmos ultimately derived from a divine source. Beneath him stood Enlil, god of the air and storms, who wielded immense power. It was Enlil who separated heaven from earth, bringing space into being. In myth after myth, Enlil appears as the one who grants kingship, who decides the fates of men and nations. He was revered, but also feared, a god whose judgments could be harsh, who once sent a flood to wipe out humanity. In the assembly of the gods, his voice carried enormous weight. Then came Enki, also known as Ea in later Akkadian tradition, the god of wisdom, fresh waters, and creation. If Enlil embodied authority and judgment, Enki represented cunning, knowledge, and compassion. He was the one who gave humanity skills, who shaped them from clay and breathed life into their forms. When Enlil decreed humanity's destruction in the Great Flood, it was Enki who secretly warned Atrahasis, instructing him to build a vessel that would preserve life. Around these figures gathered the rest of the divine assembly, Inanna, goddess of love and war whose passions shaped both desire and destruction. Ninhursag, the mother goddess linked to fertility and the earth. Utu, the sun god dispenser of justice. And Nanna, the moon god whose cycles marked the passage of time. But where do the Anunnaki fit into this picture? The name itself is revealing. Anunnaki means offspring of Anu. In its earliest usage, it referred to the great gods, the divine assembly who determined the destinies of the world. They were not a single god, but a collective, a council, a court of heaven. In hymns and incantations, they are described as the ones who fix fates. To invoke the Anunnaki was to appeal to the authority of the cosmic order itself. Over time, however, the role of the Anunnaki became more complex. In some texts, they are portrayed as the high gods, seated in judgment alongside Enlil. In others, especially later traditions, they appear as chthonic beings, associated with the underworld. In this role, they were linked to Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and to the shadowy forces that ruled over the fate of souls after death. This duality, the Anunnaki as both celestial judges and underworld powers, reflects the shifting landscape of Mesopotamian religion. As city-states rose and fell, as myths were retold and reinterpreted, the functions of the gods changed. Yet the central idea remained. The Anunnaki were the arbiters of fate, the collective will of the divine made manifest. To the Sumerians, explaining the gods was not simply a matter of cataloging their domains. It was about placing themselves within a world infused with meaning. Every natural phenomenon, every twist of fortune, was understood through the lens of divine agency. If the harvest failed, it was not a matter of poor weather alone. It was a sign of divine displeasure. If a king rose to power, it was because the gods, and especially the Anunnaki, had decreed it. The temples that dominated Sumerian cities were built as dwelling places for these gods. At Uruk, the great ziggurat rose as a home for Inanna. At Eridu, the temple of Enki was among the oldest sacred sites. In Nippur, the sanctuary of Enlil stood as the center of religious authority. In these sacred spaces, the Anunnaki were honored through rituals, sacrifices, and hymns. Priests invoked their names in incantations, asking them to avert disasters or to bless endeavors. One hymn describes the Anunnaki as the great gods who determine destinies, who fix the fates of men. Another calls them those who sit in the assembly, who decree the decisions of heaven and earth. In these lines, we see the role they played. They were not distant, abstract forces, but participants in a cosmic order that shaped human life at every level. To explain the Anunnaki, then, is to explain the very logic of Sumerian religion. They were not a single god with a single domain, like Inanna or Enki. They were the collective, the embodiment of divine order, the guarantee that the cosmos was structured, that events unfolded according to a plan, however inscrutable. And yet, this understanding was not static. By the time of the Akkadians and later Babylonians, the Anunnaki had acquired new layers of meaning. In some Akkadian texts, they were described as the gods of the underworld, numbering 7 in particular, who judged the dead. This darker aspect did not erase their earlier role, but rather expanded it. The Anunnaki came to represent both the decrees of the living and the judgment of the dead, binding human existence in life and beyond. This evolution reminds us that the Sumerian pantheon was never fixed. Religion in Mesopotamia was a living tradition, constantly reshaped by politics, culture, and time. As cities rose, their gods gained prominence. As empires fell, their myths were reinterpreted. The Anunnaki, in particular, served as a flexible category, absorbing different functions while always retaining their central role as arbiters of destiny. To modern ears, the word Anunnaki often carries associations it did not originally bear. Popular writers have recast them as ancient astronauts, as visitors from distant planets who engineered humanity. These interpretations may fascinate, but they depart from the evidence of the tablets. To the Sumerians themselves, the Anunnaki were not aliens. They were gods, powerful, inscrutable, and deeply embedded in the moral and cosmic order of the world. Explaining the Sumerian gods means entering into this worldview. It means setting aside modern categories and instead seeing the world as they did, a world where the divine was everywhere, where nothing happened without the decree of heaven. The Anunnaki were central to this vision. They were the link between the human and the divine, the ones who made the cosmos intelligible. In the end, the Anunnaki cannot be understood apart from the wider Sumerian pantheon. They are inseparable from Anu, their father, whose authority underpinned the entire structure. They are bound to Enlil, whose commands shaped nations, and to Enki, whose wisdom tempered judgment with mercy. They sit alongside Inanna, Utu, Nana, and Ninhursag, part of a divine family whose stories reflected the deepest concerns of human life: love, power, justice, survival. So when we speak of Anunnaki and Sumerian gods explained, what we are uncovering is not just a set of names from an ancient list. We are glimpsing an entire worldview, a vision of the cosmos where gods governed every aspect of existence. The Anunnaki, in their multiplicity, embodied the mystery of fate itself, the belief that behind the rise and fall of kings, the cycle of seasons, and the destiny of every soul, there was a divine order decreed in the heavens, fixed by the gods and unchangeable by man. The Sumerians, and later the Akkadians and Babylonians, lived in a land of contradictions. Southern Mesopotamia was fertile but fragile, a landscape of rivers and deserts, abundance and sudden disaster. To explain this precarious world, they turned to myth. At the heart of their stories lay the conviction that the cosmos was not accidental. It had been ordered, structured, and governed by gods whose decisions shaped the destiny of all things. Among those deities, the Anunnaki stood as arbiters of creation itself, presiding over the origins of heaven, earth, and humankind. Creation myths in Mesopotamia were not uniform. Different cities, different eras, produced different narratives. Yet common themes emerge, threads that reveal how the Anunnaki were imagined as part of this cosmic drama. One of the earliest traditions comes from Eridu, the city linked with Enki, god of wisdom and fresh waters. In Sumerian hymns, Enki is described as the shaper of humanity. Working with the mother goddess Ninhursag, he molded human beings from clay. But clay alone was lifeless. To animate these forms, the gods imparted the essence of the divine, the spark that turned dust into breathing beings. In some versions, this vital force came from the blood of a slain god, sacrificed so that humans might live. The Anunnaki, as the greatest symbol, oversaw this act, binding humanity forever to the will of heaven. In these stories, humans were not created for their own sake. They were made to serve. Life in southern Mesopotamia required labor, to dig canals, to maintain levees, to sow and harvest. The myths reflect this reality. Humanity's role was to perform the work that sustained both the land and the gods themselves. In temple hymns, priests proclaimed that men and women existed to provide offerings, to maintain the rituals, to keep the divine order intact. The Anunnaki decreed this destiny. To be human was to toil, but also to participate in the sacred task of sustaining creation. The theme of cosmic struggle is preserved most vividly in later Mesopotamian literature, particularly the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. Though composed in the 2nd millennium BCE, it drew upon earlier Sumerian traditions. In this tale, creation begins with chaos, the mingling of fresh and salt waters, personified as the gods Apsu and Tiamat. From their union emerged younger gods, whose noise and activity disturbed the primordial order. Conflict ensued. Apsu plotted their destruction, but was himself slain. Tiamat rose in fury, creating monstrous armies to avenge him. In the climax of the story, the young god Marduk faced her in battle. With a net and storm winds, he subdued her, splitting her body in two. From one half, he fashioned the heavens. From the other, the earth. Creation was born not in harmony, but in violence. Order rested from chaos. Where, then, were the Anunnaki in this cosmic struggle? The text tells us that after Marduk's victory, he organized the universe and assigned roles to the gods. The Anunnaki were stationed in heaven and on earth, guardians of order, decreeing the destinies of mankind. To honor them, Marduk built the great temple of Assyria in Babylon, placing the Anunnaki in its court as witnesses to his supremacy. Even in this later myth, the Anunnaki remained central, their presence essential to the functioning of the cosmos. Another key strand of tradition is found in the Atrahasis epic, which deals not only with creation, but with the problem of human suffering. According to this tale, the lesser gods, known as the Igigi, once labored to maintain the world. They dug canals and maintained the earth, but in time, they grew weary. In rebellion, they threw down their tools and surrounded Enlil's house in protest. Faced with this crisis, the higher gods convened the Anunnaki. Enki proposed a solution: the creation of human beings to bear the burden of labor. A god was sacrificed, his flesh and blood mixed with clay, and from this mixture humankind was formed. The Anunnaki, by decree, established humanity's role to work in place of the Igigi, to serve the temples, and to keep the divine order functioning. But this solution brought its own problems. As humans multiplied, their clamor grew intolerable. Disturbed by their noise, Enlil sought to destroy them with famine, drought, and plague. Each time, Enki intervened, finding ways to preserve life. Finally, Enlil resolved to end humanity with a flood. Once more, Enki acted in secret, warning Atrahasis, who built a boat and preserved the seed of life through the deluge. Here again, the Anunnaki appear in dual roles, as the divine assembly that decrees humanity's fate, and as the arbiters of cosmic justice, whose decisions could bless or condemn. They were not capricious in the way of human rulers, but they represented forces larger than human understanding. To the Mesopotamians, this was the explanation of life's contradictions: abundance and disaster, creation and destruction, all flowed from the decrees of the Anunnaki. The role of the Anunnaki in creation myths also reveals something deeper about the Sumerian view of existence. To modern eyes, it may seem harsh that humans were created to serve the gods, condemned to labor and mortality. But for the Sumerians, this was not a cause for despair. It was simply the structure of the cosmos. To live was to fulfill a role, to serve in the divine order established by the Anunnaki. Through rituals, sacrifices, and obedience to the decrees of heaven, humanity could find its place in the grand design. Even death was not outside this order. In myths of the underworld, the Anunnaki presided over the fate of souls, ensuring that justice extended beyond the grave. Life was short, laborious, and fraught with suffering, but it was also meaningful because it was embedded in a cosmic structure decreed at creation. What is striking is the consistency of the Anunnaki's role across these varying myths. Whether in the Sumerian hymns, the Atrahasis epic, or the Babylonian Enuma Elish, they appear as the assembly of gods who fix destinies, who witness creation, and who oversee the balance between divine and human. Their presence gave weight to the stories, anchoring them in a vision of a world that was both fragile and ordered, dangerous yet comprehensible. These myths were not idle stories told around fires. They were recited in temples, sung in rituals, and invoked in prayers. They provided explanations for why the world was as it was, why rivers flooded, why cities fell, why toil was endless. To speak of the Anunnaki in creation was to affirm that life, however difficult, was not meaningless. It had been decreed, shaped, and sanctioned by divine forces from the beginning of time. Modern interpreters, fascinated by the enigmatic references to the Anunnaki, have sometimes recast these myths in entirely different terms. They argue that the stories of clay and blood recall genetic engineering, that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials who fashioned humanity as a slave race. These theories, though captivating to popular imagination, diverge sharply from what the texts themselves reveal. The Sumerians and Babylonians did not imagine advanced aliens. They imagined gods, beings of immense power who shaped a cosmos that was at once beautiful and terrifying. To return to the tablets is to enter a different mental world, one where the line between divine and human was blurred, but never erased. The Anunnaki stood at that boundary, arbiters of creation and guardians of destiny. They were the reason the world had form, the reason humanity existed, the reason fate unfolded as it did. So when we speak of Anunnaki in Mesopotamian creation myths, we are not merely listing stories of origins. We are uncovering a worldview, one that sought to impose meaning on a precarious existence. These myths offered answers to questions that remain with us. Why are we here? Why must we labor? Why must we die? For the Sumerians, the answer lay in the decrees of the Anunnaki, the divine assembly that shaped creation, ordered the cosmos, and set humanity on its path. The stories differ in detail. In one, humans are molded from clay. In another, from the blood of a god. In one, the flood comes as punishment. In another, as the turning of an age. But through them all runs a common thread. The Anunnaki preside. They fix the destinies. They oversee the transition from chaos to order, and they bind humanity to a fate that is both burdensome and sacred. And perhaps it is this duality that makes their myths endure. For though the Sumerians lived in a world vastly different from our own, their questions were not so different. They, too, struggled with the fragility of life, the burden of work, and the inevitability of death. In their myths of creation, the Anunnaki offered both explanation and consolation. The world was not random, it was ordered. Humanity was not accidental, it was decreed. To live was to take one's place in a cosmic design, to labor under the eyes of the gods, and to accept that fate had been fixed since the beginning of time. Of all the surviving works of ancient Mesopotamia, none has traveled further in time or imagination than the Epic of Gilgamesh. Preserved on cuneiform tablets dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE, it tells the story of a king who set out to defy the limits of mortality. In its lines, we hear not only the struggles of one man, but the anxieties of a whole civilization, a people wrestling with the brevity of life, the fragility of kingship, and the shadow of the divine. And among the many gods who shape this tale, the presence of the Anunnaki is never far away. The epic begins in Uruk, a city of walls and temples, ruled by Gilgamesh. He is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a figure of immense strength and restless ambition. Yet his rule is marked by excess. The people of Uruk cry out against his arrogance, his abuse of power, his relentless energy. In answer, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man, formed from clay, who will become Gilgamesh's equal and companion. Their friendship tempers Gilgamesh, but also sets him on a path that will lead him into confrontation with the will of heaven. The first great trial comes when Gilgamesh and Enkidu confront Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest. Though Humbaba was appointed by Enlil, lord of the gods, to protect the sacred trees, the two heroes march against him. They slay the giant and cut down the forest, defying divine authority. This act, like so much in the epic, is double-edged. It brings them glory, but it also brings divine wrath. Their next challenge is even more perilous. When Gilgamesh spurns the advances of Inanna, known here in her Akkadian form as Ishtar, she unleashes the bull of heaven upon Uruk. Once again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu prevail, slaying the bull. But this time the consequences are more severe. The gods assemble, and it is here that the Anunnaki make their presence felt most clearly. The epic tells us that the Anunnaki, along with the great gods, gather to decide the fate of the heroes. Enlil speaks, declaring that one of them must die for their transgressions. The verdict falls on Enkidu. Stricken with illness, he lingers in pain, railing against the injustice of his fate. His death plunges Gilgamesh into grief so profound that it reshapes his very being. For the first time, he confronts the reality that even kings, even those of divine blood, cannot escape mortality. In these passages, the role of the Anunnaki is striking. They appear as arbiters of destiny, seated in judgment. Their decision seals Enkidu's fate, reminding both hero and reader that human defiance has limits. In the Sumerian imagination, the Anunnaki were those who fixed the fates. Here, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that function is dramatized with devastating clarity. The death of Enkidu propels Gilgamesh into the second half of the epic, his quest for immortality. Unable to accept his own mortality, he journeys across deserts and seas, determined to find a way to escape death. His path takes him to Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, who dwells in a far-off land. Utnapishtim tells his story, how the gods once resolved to destroy humanity with a deluge, and how Enki secretly warned him, instructing him to build a vessel. Through this act, life was preserved. After the flood, the gods convened. Enlil, who had decreed destruction, was appeased, and the Anunnaki, gathered with the great gods, granted Utnapishtim and his wife eternal life. But this gift was unique, a one-time exception. For the rest of humanity, the decree of the Anunnaki was clear: death is the fate of all mortals. This scene is crucial. It shows us how the Sumerians and Babylonians understood the boundary between gods and men. Immortality was not attainable through effort or conquest. It could not be seized, even by the greatest king. It could only be bestowed by divine decree, and for Gilgamesh, no such decree would come. The epic reaches its climax when Gilgamesh, having failed to secure eternal life, returns to Uruk. He looks upon the city walls, the temples, the great structures that his hands have built. In these, he sees a different kind of immortality, not the unending life of the body, but the enduring legacy of human achievement. The epic ends not with victory, but with wisdom, an acknowledgement of mortality, and an acceptance of the place of humanity within the cosmic order decreed by the Anunnaki. What does it mean, then, to explain the Epic of Gilgamesh through the lens of the Anunnaki? First, it highlights the theological core of the story. Gilgamesh's struggle is not simply against nature or fate in the abstract, but against the decrees of the divine assembly. The Anunnaki embody the inescapable structure of existence. They are the ones who determine life and death, who assign fates even to heroes. Their judgment on Enkidu, their gift of immortality to Utnapishtim, their silence toward Gilgamesh, all reinforce their role as guardians of the cosmic order. Second, it reveals the epic's deeper concern with kingship. Gilgamesh is a ruler, charged with governing a city and embodying divine authority. His confrontation with mortality is not only personal, but political. The Anunnaki's decrees remind him, and the audience, that kingship itself is bounded. No king rules forever. No dynasty escapes the cycle of rise and fall. The Anunnaki, as arbiters of fate, ensure that even the mightiest are subject to the same laws as all mortals. The epic also reveals the complexity of Mesopotamian attitudes toward the gods. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as cruel tyrants, nor as benevolent protectors. They are inscrutable, their judgments beyond human appeal. When they decree Enkidu's death, there is no recourse. When they grant Utnapishtim eternal life, it is not because he earned it, but because the moment required it. Their decisions are absolute, their authority unquestioned. This reflects a worldview in which divine order was both necessary and impenetrable, a structure within which humanity lived, struggled, and died. Yet the epic is not without hope. Gilgamesh's failure to secure immortality is also his moment of transformation. He learns that meaning is not found in defying the decrees of the Anunnaki, but in accepting them. To build, to govern wisely, to leave a legacy. These are how mortals participate in the cosmic order. The walls of Uruk become his monument, a symbol of human achievement within the boundaries set by the gods. Modern readers often approach the Epic of Gilgamesh with different questions. They ask whether the flood story recalls historical events, whether the myths preserve memories of ancient cataclysms. They speculate on the identity of the Anunnaki, seeing in them evidence of extraterrestrial visitors who shaped humanity's destiny. These interpretations, while popular, move far from the meaning the epic held for its original audience. For the Sumerians and Babylonians, the Anunnaki were not aliens. They were the divine assembly, the arbiters of fate, whose decrees gave meaning to existence. To read the Epic of Gilgamesh in its original context is to hear the voice of an ancient civilization confronting the same questions we still ask today. Why do we die? What is the meaning of life? How should we live, knowing our time is short? The answers they found were framed in myth, in stories of gods and heroes, in the decrees of the Anunnaki. And though the answers differ from our own, the questions are universal, timeless, and deeply human. So when we speak of Anunnaki and the Epic of Gilgamesh, what we uncover is not simply a story of gods and kings, but a meditation on mortality and meaning. The Anunnaki are not distant figures, but central actors in the drama. They decree the fate of Enkidu. They set the bounds of human life. They hold the key to immortality, and they keep it closed. Through their presence, the epic affirms a vision of the world in which destiny is fixed, mortality is inevitable, and wisdom lies in acceptance. For Gilgamesh, the lesson is hard-won. He does not find eternal life, but he finds something else. The recognition that to be human is not to defy the decrees of the Anunnaki, but to live within them, to build, to create, to remember, and to be remembered. And in this, perhaps, lies the most enduring message of the epic, that though the gods decree our mortality, it is within our power to shape the meaning of our brief, precious time on Earth. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the world of the Sumerians had changed. Their cities remained, Uruk, Uar, Nippur, but their independence was fading. New powers arose. The Akkadians, speakers of a Semitic language, who built an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Later still came Babylon, with its towering ziggurats and its kings whose names still echo through history, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar. Yet even as empires rose and fell, the gods endured. Among them, the Anunnaki remained, reshaped but never forgotten, woven into new myths, new rituals, new visions of the divine order. The Akkadians inherited much from the Sumerians. Their cuneiform script, their pantheon, their stories, all were adopted, adapted, and given new voice in Akkadian. Where the Sumerians had spoken of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, the Akkadians spoke of Anu, Elul, and Ea. Where the Sumerians had told tales of Inanna, the Akkadians knew Ishtar. The gods were continuous, yet transformed by a new language and a new culture. And the Anunnaki, those shadowy figures of fate and judgment, found a place within this shifting pantheon. In Akkadian literature, the Anunnaki appear most clearly in contexts of the underworld and destiny. The Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian flood myth, presents them alongside the Igigi, a separate class of gods. The Igigi, weary of their labors, rebel against the higher deities. In response, humans are created to bear the burden of work. The Anunnaki, by contrast, are invoked in solemn assemblies, gods whose decrees shape the fates of mortals and immortals alike. This division, Igigi above, Anunnaki below, became a feature of later tradition. The Anunnaki were often associated with the underworld, with chthonic power, with the inevitability of death. Yet their role was not confined to gloom. They were judges, arbiters, those who fixed the destinies of men and kings. To speak of the Anunnaki in Akkadian texts is to speak of the invisible architecture of the cosmos, the unseen council that ordered existence. As Babylon rose to prominence in the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Anunnaki were drawn into new narratives. Chief among them was the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic. Composed to celebrate the supremacy of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, this myth recounts the cosmic battle against Tiamat, the primordial chaos dragon. In the story, when Tiamat assembles her monstrous forces to wage war on the younger gods, the Anunnaki are present. They are not the warriors who take up arms. That role falls to Marduk, but they are the assembly before whom destinies are decreed. After Marduk's victory, it is before the Anunnaki that his kingship is proclaimed. They bestow upon him the symbols of authority, affirming his role as ruler of gods and men. In this way, the Anunnaki, once arbiters of fate in Sumerian myths, become endorsers of Marduk's supremacy in Babylonian religion. This shift reflects more than theology, it reflects politics. Just as Marduk's rise mirrored the rise of Babylon as a city, so too did the Anunnaki serve to legitimize his rule. By presenting Marduk as a god whose authority was sanctioned by the ancient council of the Anunnaki, Babylonian priests grounded their city's power in the deepest strata of Mesopotamian tradition. Another Akkadian text, The Descent of Ishtar to the Underworld, offers a darker glimpse of the Anunnaki. Here, when Ishtar passes through the gates of the netherworld, she confronts the 7 judges of the Anunnaki. These figures sit in judgment, their gaze terrifying, their decrees inescapable. When they look upon her, they fix their eyes, and their word brings death. Stripped of her power, Ishtar is reduced to a corpse and hung on a hook. Only through the intervention of other gods is she restored to life. This episode illustrates the fearful side of the Anunnaki in Akkadian imagination. They are not kindly overseers, nor distant abstractions, but stern judges, impartial and unyielding. Their realm is the underworld, their concern the balance of life and death, and their authority beyond appeal. For the people of Babylon, to invoke the Anunnaki was to acknowledge the inevitability of mortality and the power of divine judgment. Yet even as their roles shifted, the Anunnaki retained an aura of antiquity. To name them was to invoke the weight of tradition, the authority of the earliest gods. Ritual texts often listed them in litanies, alongside newer deities, as if to root present worship in ancient foundations. They appear in incantations, in prayers for protection, in curses inscribed on tablets buried beneath buildings. The phrase by the Anunnaki carried power, a binding force, a way of calling upon the most primordial authority known to Mesopotamia. In Babylonian religion, the Anunnaki also embodied a cosmic balance. The Ijiji in the heavens, the Anunnaki in the underworld, together they mirrored the structure of the universe. Above and below, light and darkness, life and death, all held in tension. The Anunnaki's place in this scheme reflected the Mesopotamian conviction that the world was ordered, that every element had its proper sphere, and that divine decrees ensured the balance was maintained. We must remember, too, that Babylonian culture was one of scribes and scholars, men who copied, compiled, and commented on texts across centuries. In their hands, the Anunnaki became part of a living archive. Each retelling, each reinterpretation layered new meanings onto old. A flood myth here, a descent to the underworld there, a creation epic exalting Marduk. In every context, the Anunnaki served as the background chorus of divine authority. Even in legal texts and royal inscriptions, their presence is felt. Kings swore oaths by the gods, by the Anunnaki. To break such an oath was to invite disaster, not only from the living, but from the deepest powers of the cosmos. This blending of religion, law, and politics shows how deeply ingrained the Anunnaki were in the cultural fabric of Akkadian and Babylonian life. Over time, the image of the Anunnaki became more shadowed, more associated with the underworld. The chthonic aspect, already present in Sumerian myth, grew stronger. Later Babylonian and Assyrian texts described them as judges of the dead, stern and silent, dwelling in the land from which none return. In rituals for the dead, their names were invoked, a reminder that the fate of the departed lay in their hands. Yet even here, ambiguity remains. Were the Anunnaki gods of the underworld alone, or cosmic arbiters who presided over both life and death? The texts vary, the traditions overlap, and the boundaries blur. This very ambiguity may explain their enduring fascination. The Anunnaki are never fully defined, never neatly contained. They hover on the edge of clarity, figures of immense power whose true nature remains elusive. What we see in Akkadian and Babylonian myths, then, is both continuity and transformation. The Anunnaki of Uruk and Nippur do not vanish. They are absorbed into new stories, new theologies, new empires. They become the judges of the underworld, the endorsers of kings, the chorus of divine authority that gives weight to oaths and rituals. They always remain the fixers of fates, the powers behind the visible world, the gods whose decrees cannot be overturned. For the people of these empires, to live was to live under the gaze of the Anunnaki. Every birth, every death, every rise and fall of a king was framed within their decrees. And though their forms changed, their essence endured. They were the arbiters of existence, the unseen council whose word shaped the destiny of all. Today, when modern theories speak of the Anunnaki as visitors from the stars, they often overlook this deeper history. They forget the Akkadian scribes, the Babylonian priests, the centuries of ritual and belief that gave the Anunnaki their meaning. To the ancients, these were not aliens. They were gods, judges, powers as old as time itself, woven into the myths that bound their world together. To read the Akkadian and Babylonian myths is to see the Anunnaki not as intruders from beyond, but as symbols of continuity, of the persistence of tradition amid the flux of empire. In their name, kings claimed legitimacy. In their decrees, mortals found meaning. In their gaze, even the gods trembled. And across centuries, their presence endured, a reminder that beneath the shifting surface of history lay a bedrock of belief, unshaken, unforgotten. So when we speak of Anunnaki in Akkadian and Babylonian myths, what emerges is not a single story, but a chorus of voices. In the flood myths, they stand as arbiters of destiny. In the Enuma Elish, they endorse the rule of Marduk. In the descent of Ishtar, they sit as judges of the dead. In every context, their role is to affirm, to decree, to bind. They are the thread that runs through the tapestry of Mesopotamian belief, binding together empires and ages in the name of fate. And in their endurance, they remind us of the power of myth to adapt, to survive, to carry the weight of memory across millennia. The Anunnaki of Akkad and Babylon were not the same as those of Sumer, but they were not different either. They were the same gods, refracted through new empires, new needs, new imaginations. And in this way, they live on still, as symbols of a world where fate was fixed, death was inevitable, and divine authority was eternal. Beneath the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, beneath the fields watered by the Tigris and Euphrates, the ancients believed there stretched a realm of dust and silence. It was called Irkalla, the land of no return. Every soul, whether king or slave, hero or farmer, descended there in the end. In this dim kingdom, light never shone, rivers were dry, and the dead lived as shadows, feeding on dust. Presiding over this place was Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Yet she did not rule alone. At her side sat the Anunnaki, the ancient gods, stern and inscrutable, who judged the fates of the departed. The Mesopotamian underworld was not imagined as a place of punishment or reward. It was not paradise nor torment. Instead, it was inevitability, a leveling ground where all distinctions of wealth and power were erased. To understand the Anunnaki in this context is to glimpse the Mesopotamian confrontation with mortality, their sense of a cosmos where even the mightiest were subject to the decrees of the underworld gods. In Sumerian hymns, the Anunnaki are called the Seven Judges. They sit with Ereshkigal, their gaze terrible, their word unalterable. In the descent of Inanna, one of the oldest myths to survive, the goddess ventures down into the netherworld. At each of the seven gates, she is stripped of her garments, her jewels, her symbols of power, until she stands naked before the throne of Ereshkigal. There, the Anunnaki fix their gaze upon her. Their judgment is swift and merciless. They pronounce the word of death, and Inanna's body is hung upon a hook. Only through cunning and negotiation does she return to life, but the lesson is clear. Before the Anunnaki, even gods are powerless. Their decrees bind all beings, mortal and divine alike. They are not executioners, not tormentors, but arbiters, those who weigh, who decide, who enact the laws of an ordered cosmos. This image recurs in later Akkadian texts. In the descent of Ishtar, the goddess confronts the same inexorable law. Again, the Anunnaki appear as the seven judges of the underworld, seated in solemn council. Their eyes flash with terrifying power. Their words bring silence and death. To face them was to face the inevitability of mortality, to stand before the embodiment of fate itself. In these myths, the Anunnaki function as a divine court. Just as kings on earth presided over councils, deciding disputes, so too the Anunnaki presided in the depths, deciding the fate of every soul. Their authority was not arbitrary. It was systemic, cosmic. To the Mesopotamians, the universe was governed by decrees, fixed laws spoken by the gods. And in the underworld, the Anunnaki were those who enforced them. What, then, was the underworld itself? Archaeological texts and hymns describe it in bleak detail. The dead were called Giddim, shadowy spirits who lingered in the dust. They had no flesh, no vitality. Their sustenance was crumbs, their drink muddy water. Only if the living remembered them, offering libations and prayers, could they find some relief. Otherwise, they wandered hungry, forgotten. In this world of shadows, the Anunnaki loomed as unyielding overseers. Their role was not to comfort, but to maintain order. Inscriptions describe them as the great gods of the underworld, and they are often invoked in curses. May the Anunnaki strike down he who breaks this tablet. Such invocations reveal both fear and respect. To call upon the Anunnaki was to summon the weight of inevitability, to bind an oath by the most ancient powers of death itself. The queen of this realm, Ereshkigal, presided over the daily life of the dead. But the Anunnaki gave her reign its gravity. Together they formed the court of the underworld, silent, austere, but essential. Without their judgment, death would be chaos. With it, the world of the living was ordered, framed by the certainty that life ended, that fate was sealed, that all journeys led to Irkalla. This vision of the afterlife shaped Mesopotamian attitudes toward life itself. Unlike later religions that promised paradise or punishment, the Sumerians and Babylonians saw death as a universal reduction. In this worldview, meaning was not found in hopes of heavenly reward, but in the deeds done during life. Kings built monuments, cities, and laws not because they expected eternal bliss, but because these were the legacies that endured after death. The Anunnaki, as guardians of the underworld, were constant reminders of this truth. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, this theme is felt with crushing weight. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh dreams of the underworld. He sees the realm where kings, priests, and warriors all sit together in dust, their crowns set aside, their power gone. It is not a place of torment, but of sameness, the great equalizer. And always, in the background, the Anunnaki preside, their decrees unchallenged, their silence unbroken. These myths shaped rituals for the dead. Families poured libations into clay pipes that reached graves, offering beer and bread to sustain the Giddim. They whispered prayers, calling upon the Anunnaki to receive the departed. In royal tombs, treasures and sacrifices were buried, not to grant paradise, but to ease the transition into the shadowed world. The Anunnaki were the gatekeepers of this process, their authority invoked in every burial, every ritual, every prayer. It is tempting, from a modern perspective, to see this vision as grim, even despairing. Yet for the Mesopotamians, it was simply reality. Death was inevitable. The Anunnaki ensured it was ordered. Far from despair, this gave urgency to life. To build, to rule justly, to secure remembrance. These were acts of defiance against oblivion. In a cosmos where the Anunnaki ruled the underworld, the only immortality was legacy. This explains why Mesopotamian kings so often invoked the Anunnaki in their inscriptions. By Anu, by Enlil, by the Anunnaki, they declared, binding their words with the most ancient authority. To call upon the Anunnaki was to root oneself in cosmic order, to claim legitimacy not only from the heavens, but from the depths of the earth itself. It was a reminder that power was fleeting, that only divine decree endured. Over centuries, the underworld myths deepened. Assyrian texts describe the Anunnaki as judges who sat in eternal session. Ritual incantations list their names and litanies, appealing to them for protection or warding them off in fear. Their number varies, sometimes 7, sometimes more, but always they represent the fullness of the divine court. They are not individuals with vivid personalities, but a collective presence, a chorus of inevitability. In this way, the Anunnaki of the underworld resemble fate itself. There are fewer characters than functions, embodiments of the cosmic principle that life ends, that decrees are fixed, that order is maintained. Their silence, their implacability, gave form to the Mesopotamian sense of mortality. Modern fascination with the Anunnaki often overlooks this role. Instead of underworld judges, they are imagined as sky-faring visitors, bringers of knowledge, makers of humanity. Yet to the people who first inscribed their names, the Anunnaki were far more intimate, far more unsettling. They were the gods waiting at the end of every road, the silent judges in the land of no return. To explain Anunnaki and the Mesopotamian underworld is therefore to strip away modern projections and return to the dust-filled chambers of Irkalla. It is to see them as the ancients saw them, not as saviors, not as tormentors, but as the guardians of inevitability. They were the ones who decreed that Inanna must die before she could live again. They were the ones who gazed upon Ishtar and stripped her of power. They were the ones who sat in judgment over every mortal soul, binding the world of the living to the world of the dead. What, then, do we learn from this vision? We learn that for the Mesopotamians, life was precious precisely because it ended. We learn that kingship, achievement, and memory, these were the only defenses against oblivion. We learn that myth, in its starkest form, is not about comfort but about truth. The truth that mortality defines us, and that beyond lies silence. And in that silence, the Anunnaki sit, unseen, unchanging, waiting, the great council of the underworld, whose decrees no one escapes. In their presence, Inanna fell. In their gaze, Ishtar trembled. In their court, every soul of Mesopotamia found its end. To speak of them is to remember the first great civilization's answer to death. To hear their name is to hear the weight of inevitability. To imagine their gaze is to confront the same truth they embodied, that life is short, that memory is fragile, and that beyond, in the land of dust, the Anunnaki judge all alike. Across the northern plains of Mesopotamia, in the cities of Ashur, Nineveh, and Nimrud, a new power rose. The Assyrians, fierce warriors, master builders, and relentless conquerors, carved out an empire that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt. Their armies marched with iron weapons, their kings proclaimed dominion over all lands, and their palaces gleamed with reliefs that still speak of power and terror. Yet beneath this display of might lay something older, a mythology that reached back to Sumer, to Akkad, to the dawn of Mesopotamian civilization. The Anunnaki, once shadowy judges of the underworld, became in Assyrian ideology the guarantors of empire. To invoke them was to cloak conquest in divine legitimacy, to declare that Assyria's kings ruled not merely by the sword, but by the decree of gods whose authority stretched from heaven to the land of the dead. In Assyrian royal inscriptions, the Anunnaki appear as a collective chorus, invoked alongside the great gods Anu, Enlil, and Ishtar. When kings carved their achievements in a stone, they swore by Ashur, Shamash, Eddad, and the Anunnaki, binding their words with the weight of the most ancient order. These were not casual invocations. In the Mesopotamian mind, to swear by the Anunnaki was to summon the judgment of the underworld itself, to risk the anger of those who sat in eternal session beneath the earth. For an oath bound by the Anunnaki, no human could escape retribution. This use of the Anunnaki reveals much about Assyrian ideology. Empire was not sustained by violence alone. It required cosmic sanction, a claim that conquest was not mere human ambition but divine destiny. The Anunnaki, as guardians of inevitability, provided that sanction. Their presence in inscriptions, curses, and treaties framed Assyria's expansion as part of a cosmic order, decreed by gods whose authority no rival could question. We see this in the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned in the 9th century BCE. His inscriptions do not merely boast of conquests and massacres. They root his kingship in divine decree. In one text, he swears by the gods of heaven and the Anunnaki of the earth, binding future rulers to uphold his foundations. In another, he curses anyone who would alter his inscriptions, declaring that the Anunnaki will destroy their name and their seed. Here, the Anunnaki are not underworld judges alone, but enforcers of imperial memory. To erase a king's words was to invite the wrath of the deepest gods, to risk oblivion at their hands. The same pattern continues with Shalmaneser III, whose black obelisk still stands as one of the most vivid monuments of Assyrian power. In its inscriptions, after long lists of campaigns and tribute, the king again invokes the Anunnaki. The message is clear: these achievements are not his alone. They are secured, witnessed, and upheld by the ancient gods. In the later Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Anunnaki became still more closely tied to ideology. Kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal ruled over vast territories, claiming dominion over lands as far away as Cyprus and Egypt. Their palaces at Nineveh were adorned with colossal stone panels, reliefs that depicted not only battles, but divine symbols: winged genies, sacred trees, and the horned crowns of gods. Though the Anunnaki themselves are rarely pictured in these reliefs, their presence lurked in the inscriptions that accompanied them. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, left an extraordinary library filled with clay tablets. In its texts, we find incantations and rituals that still call upon the Anunnaki. Their names are invoked in curses, their authority embedded in treaties, their role preserved in hymns. For Ashurbanipal, who saw himself not only as a warrior but as a scholar, the Anunnaki linked him to the deepest roots of Mesopotamian tradition. In a time of shifting power, when Assyria faced enemies on every side, the authority of the Anunnaki provided continuity, a reassurance that the empire was sanctioned by forces older than memory itself. But why would a militarized empire turn to underworld gods? To answer this, we must understand how the Assyrians conceived of power. For them, kingship was cosmic. The king was not merely a ruler. He was the chosen of Ashur, the earthly agent of the gods. His conquests mirrored divine order, pushing back chaos. To bind this mission with the Anunnaki was to root it in inevitability, to claim that Assyrian dominion was as unchangeable as death itself. When treaties were sworn between Assyria and subject kings, the Anunnaki were called as witnesses. To break such a treaty was to invite not just political reprisal, but divine annihilation. The Anunnaki would strike down oath breakers, erasing their memory from the world. This fusion of politics and theology gave Assyria a powerful ideological weapon. Submission to Assyria was not merely pragmatic. It was cosmic destiny, enforced by the most ancient gods of Sumer and Akkad. This can be seen in the formula of curses inscribed on foundation tablets. When Assyrian kings laid the first stones of palaces or temples, they buried inscriptions beneath them, calling on the Anunnaki to guard their works. Anyone who tampered with these foundations was doomed to destruction. The Anunnaki, invisible and eternal, became guardians of the empire's permanence. As long as they upheld the king's decree, his works would endure. The psychological weight of such invocations cannot be overstated. For subject peoples, to hear the Anunnaki named was to be reminded of the most inescapable truths of Mesopotamian religion. These were not foreign gods imposed by conquerors. They were the ancient lords of fate, the same powers who had judged their ancestors for millennia. By invoking them, the Assyrians wrapped their imperial project in the mantle of inevitability. Yet, there is an irony here. The Assyrians, who saw themselves upheld by the eternal decrees of the Anunnaki, would themselves fall. In 612 BCE, Nineveh burned, its walls shattered by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The empire that had seemed invincible vanished almost overnight. And in the ruins, those foundation inscriptions remained, still invoking the Anunnaki, still cursing any who disturbed them. The empire had fallen, but the names of the ancient gods endured. This collapse reveals a deeper truth about the Anunnaki's role. They were not guarantors of victory, nor protectors of empire. They were arbiters of fate. For a time, they sanctioned Assyria's rise, its terror, its splendor. But when the decree changed, when destiny shifted, even Assyria fell before their silent judgment. In later centuries, when scholars excavated the ruins of Nineveh and Nimrud, They unearthed the clay tablets that preserved these invocations. Modern readers have puzzled over the Anunnaki, projecting onto them myths of alien visitors or lost civilizations. But the Assyrians did not see them so. To the kings of Mesopotamia's greatest empire, the Anunnaki were something both darker and more profound. They were the voice of inevitability, the sanction of death, the guardians of cosmic law. To rule by their decree was to claim permanence, to cloak conquest in timeless legitimacy. And yet, the ruins tell another story. Palaces crumbled, empires fell, but the names of the Anunnaki survived, etched into stone, pressed into clay, buried beneath shattered walls. Even in silence, their authority lingers. They remind us that empire is fleeting, that even the greatest powers bow before inevitability, and that behind the rise and fall of nations, the Anunnaki sit in eternal council, watching, waiting. To understand the Anunnaki in Assyrian power and empire, then, is to see the convergence of myth and politics, of death and dominion. It is to recognize how ancient kings bound their rule not only to the swords of their armies, but to the decrees of gods who embodied the unchangeable order of the cosmos. The Assyrians are long gone. Their empire is dust, but their kings still speak, across 3,000 years, in inscriptions that call upon the Anunnaki. And in those words, the old gods still whisper, guardians of memory, witnesses of fate, arbiters of the rise and fall of empires. In the city of Babylon, where the Euphrates curled its slow course through temples and ziggurats, myth and mathematics converged. To the Babylonians, the sky was no empty expanse. It was a living tablet, written with the movements of stars and planets, each marking the will of the gods. Night after night, generations of priest astronomers recorded the heavens, charting patterns, eclipses, and conjunctions with a precision that astonishes modern science. Yet their gaze was not neutral. For them, the stars were alive with meaning. They were the signs by which the gods spoke, the stage upon which fate was enacted. At the heart of this worldview stood the Anunnaki. In Babylonian religion, they had long ceased to be simply underworld judges. They became woven into the fabric of cosmic order itself, the hidden powers whose decrees governed both the fate of kings and the courses of stars. When Babylon rose to prominence in the second millennium BCE, it inherited the religious traditions of Sumer and Akkad, but reshaped them into something distinct. Chief among its innovations was the elevation of Marduk, the city's patron god, who supplanted older deities in the Babylonian pantheon. In the great creation epic, the Enuma Elish, Marduk defeats the chaos monster Tiamat, fashions the world from her body, and establishes the divine assembly. At the climax of this tale, Marduk distributes authority among the gods. He organizes the heavens, assigns duties, and divides the cosmos into realms. The Anunnaki are there, receiving their stations in this new order. No longer were they merely the silent lords of the underworld. In Babylonian thought, they were identified with the stars themselves, fixed points of fate in the night sky. Lists of stars from Babylonian astronomical texts often refer to them as the Anunnaki of the heavens, contrasting them with the Igigi, sometimes associated with wandering planets. This duality suggests that the Anunnaki came to symbolize the enduring, unchanging stars, eternal judges looking down from the firmament, watching the affairs of humans unfold. This blending of theology and astronomy gave the Anunnaki new significance. To invoke them was to appeal not only to gods of myth, but to the very architecture of the cosmos. The fixed stars represented permanence, constancy, and law. By identifying the Anunnaki with them, the Babylonians tied their authority to the unshakable cycles of the sky. We see this reflected in rituals and prayers. Babylonian kings, when they swore oaths or dedicated temples, often called upon the great gods of heaven and the Anunnaki. These invocations fused cosmic law with political law. To disobey the king was not only rebellion against earthly authority, but a violation of an order written in the stars. The practical side of Babylonian astronomy reinforced this connection. In the great temple of Assyria, priests known as Chaldeans kept continuous watch on the heavens. They recorded eclipses, planetary movements, and unusual stellar events on clay tablets. These records, spanning centuries, became the backbone of Babylonian astrology. Patterns were correlated with events on Earth. A lunar eclipse might presage the death of a king. A conjunction of planets could foretell famine or war. In these interpretations, the Anunnaki loomed in the background as the ultimate arbiters of fate. One series of texts, known as the Enuma Anu Enlil, compiled hundreds of omens drawn from celestial phenomena. It repeatedly frames the heavens as the realm of divine judges. Though individual planets were often linked with specific gods, Jupiter with Marduk, Venus with Ishtar, Saturn with Ninurta, the collective judgment of the sky still belonged to the Anunnaki. They were the silent council, their decisions written not in speech but in light. To understand the weight of this, we must remember that Babylonian astronomy was not a separate discipline from religion. It was a religious practice. Observing the stars was a form of listening to the gods. Recording their movements was an act of devotion, a way to align human affairs with cosmic order. In this system, the Anunnaki stood as the ultimate guarantors of meaning. They were not distant abstractions, but living principles, guiding the destinies of kings and cities. The connection between the Anunnaki and astronomy also appears in myth. In later hymns, they are described as dwelling in the chambers of heaven, shining as bright stars. In some incantations, the Anunnaki are invoked to protect against demons or misfortune, their stellar presence imagined as a canopy over the earth. Here, theology and cosmology merge. The underworld judges of old Sumer have become celestial guardians, their gaze eternal, their decrees carved into the heavens themselves. But Babylonian religion was not static. Over centuries, as Babylon fell under Assyrian, Persian, and eventually Hellenistic rule, its mythology adapted. Greek writers who encountered Mesopotamian traditions sometimes described the Chaldeans as priests who worshipped the stars as gods. It is possible that, to foreign eyes, the Anunnaki appeared simply as stellar deities, their deeper role as underworld judges obscured by layers of reinterpretation. Yet in Babylonian texts themselves, the duality remained. The Anunnaki were both celestial and chthonic, both the stars above and the judges below. This paradox reflects a deeper truth of Mesopotamian cosmology. Heaven and underworld were not separate realms, but two sides of the same law. Fate was as unyielding as the stars and as inescapable as death. One striking example of this synthesis comes from Babylonian ritual calendars. Certain festivals aligned with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, or heliacal risings of key stars. During these times, priests performed rites that invoked both the heavenly gods and the Anunnaki. The symbolism is clear. Cosmic cycles were moments when the boundaries between heaven, earth, and underworld blurred. The Anunnaki, embodying this convergence, were invoked to stabilize the transition, to ensure that time itself flowed in harmony with divine decree. This concern with time reveals another aspect of Babylonian thought. The Anunnaki were linked not just to stars, but to the measurement of time itself. In Mesopotamian tradition, time was cyclical, governed by celestial patterns. By identifying the Anunnaki with the fixed stars, the Babylonians anchored their concept of fate in the recurring motions of the cosmos. To live under their decree was to exist within an unchanging rhythm, where each season, each year, unfolded according to patterns laid down at the dawn of creation. For kings, this connection carried profound implications. When Hammurabi, the famous lawgiver, claimed authority from the gods, He embedded his rule in this cosmic order. His laws, carved on stele, were framed as eternal, unalterable decrees. Later Babylonian rulers did the same, often dedicating their monuments to the Anunnaki of heaven and earth. The message was unambiguous. Their rule was as fixed as the stars, as inevitable as the turning of the heavens. The psychological power of this cannot be underestimated. For the people of Babylon, to look up at the night sky was to see not only beauty but law. Every constellation, every bright point, was a reminder that life unfolded under the gaze of ancient judges. The Anunnaki had become the stars themselves, a living court suspended in the heavens, their decrees shining down upon earth. And yet, just as with Assyria before, the fate decreed by the Anunnaki was not eternal for Babylon. The city fell to the Persians, then to the Greeks, its temples abandoned, its ziggurat crumbling into ruin. But even as the empire collapsed, its astronomy endured. Babylonian star catalogs were preserved, transmitted to the Greeks, and through them to later civilizations. The legacy of the Anunnaki, bound to the stars, outlived the empire that had reimagined them. Today, when we speak of constellations, of zodiac signs, of celestial omens, we are echoing ideas first formulated in Babylon. The Anunnaki, once judges of the dead, became arbiters of time, woven into the fabric of astronomy itself. Their decrees survive not only in broken tablets, but in every horoscope, every observation of celestial cycles that traces its lineage back to Mesopotamia. To explore the Anunnaki in Babylonian religion and astronomy, then, is to glimpse the extraordinary fusion of myth and science, of story and calculation. It is to see how ancient priests transformed the sky into scripture, how the movements of planets became sentences in a cosmic law, and how the Anunnaki, ancient, shadowy, and eternal, became the silent witnesses of the heavens. The stars still wheel above us, their patterns unchanged for millennia. To the Babylonians, they were the Anunnaki, fixed points of divine judgment. To us, they are galaxies and suns, objects of scientific wonder. But behind our modern understanding lingers the echo of an older vision, a sky alive with gods, fate written in starlight, and the eternal watch of the Anunnaki. When the last Mesopotamian temples fell silent, when the ziggurats of Babylon crumbled and the libraries of Nineveh were buried in dust, the Anunnaki did not vanish. Their names, etched into clay tablets, survived the ruin of empires. And their stories, reshaped and refracted, lived on in the myths and religions of peoples who inherited fragments of Mesopotamian thought. To trace their legacy is to follow the migration of symbols across cultures, watching as ancient gods become new figures, as memories of the Anunnaki ripple outward through time. The Hebrew Bible, composed in the shadow of Mesopotamian civilization, preserves some of these echoes. The story of the flood in Genesis, with its ark, its righteous survivor, and its destruction of humankind, is almost certainly shaped by the older Mesopotamian flood myths. In those earlier tales, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki play roles as arbiters of destruction and survival. When the Bible retells the story, the names have changed, but the structure remains. The Council of Gods who decreed humanity's destruction finds a parallel in the single will of Yahweh. The continuity is unmistakable. Behind the biblical flood stands the shadow of the Anunnaki. Another echo can be found in the concept of divine assemblies. In Mesopotamian religion, the gods met in councils, often with the Anunnaki as the great collective beneath the heavens. In the Hebrew Bible, we catch glimpses of a similar divine court. The book of Job opens with the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord, a scene that mirrors the assemblies of Mesopotamian deities. Though transformed by monotheism, the idea of a divine council may carry the imprint of those earlier traditions. As Mesopotamian culture mingled with the wider Near East, Greek writers also took notice. Herodotus, Ctesias, and later Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek, relayed fragments of Mesopotamian mythology to Hellenistic audiences. In Berossus's accounts, figures reminiscent of the Anunnaki appear in stories of creation and kingship. Over time, Greek myth absorbed certain themes: divine rulers of fate, stern judges of the dead, and councils of gods who determined destiny. Though the Olympians and the Anunnaki are not the same, the structural parallels suggest a diffusion of ideas across cultural boundaries. In particular, the role of underworld judges resonates strongly. The Anunnaki, seated in eternal judgment below the earth, find curious reflections in Greek Hades, where judges like Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Aeacus preside over the dead. The imagery is not identical, but the concept that the afterlife involves trial before divine arbiters may owe something to the influence of Mesopotamian thought carried westward through trade, conquest, and storytelling. In Iranian tradition, too, we find shadows. Zoroastrianism, which arose in the first millennium BCE, posits a cosmic struggle between forces of truth, Asha, and falsehood, Daruj. Though shaped by its own unique worldview, Zoroastrian cosmology shares certain structural affinities with Mesopotamian religion. The notion of divine beings who uphold law and order, set against chaotic forces, resonates with the earlier role of the Anunnaki as guarantors of fate and cosmic stability. Later, under the Persian Achaemenid Empire, Mesopotamian priests and scribes served side by side with Iranian magi. In this mingling of traditions, elements of Anunnaki lore may have been absorbed, reinterpreted, and reemployed in ways that remain difficult to disentangle. The Anunnaki's legacy stretches further still into the apocalyptic literature of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Jewish tradition, describes the Watchers, angelic beings who descended to earth, corrupted humankind, and were cast into the depths for judgment. Scholars have long debated the origins of this myth, but its resonances with Mesopotamian themes are striking. The idea of a divine group, ancient and powerful, who transgress and are bound in an underworld of judgment, bears more than a passing resemblance to conceptions of the Anunnaki. These Watchers, in later Christian thought, became part of the demonology of fallen angels. Through such channels, echoes of Mesopotamian myth may have slipped quietly into the imagination of Western religion, reshaped but still recognizable. Medieval and Islamic traditions, too, preserved fragments. In Islamic cosmology, the jinn are beings created before humans, living in realms beyond our sight, capable of both good and evil. While not directly descended from the Anunnaki, the idea of ancient, hidden beings who influence human destiny resonates with Mesopotamian antecedents. Medieval scholars who translated Greek and Syriac works often encountered references to Chaldean wisdom, a term that, in the ancient world, had meant Babylonian astronomy and magic, steeped in the legacy of the Anunnaki. In this way, the name Chaldean became synonymous with occult knowledge in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. To study astrology, to trace the fate of human lives in the stars, was to draw on a tradition that had once placed the Anunnaki themselves among the constellations. Though their names had been forgotten, their role as cosmic arbiters lingered. The most dramatic modern reimagining of the Anunnaki came in the 20th century through the works of Zecharia Sitchin and the rise of the ancient astronaut theory. Sitchin, misinterpreting Mesopotamian texts, claimed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth in antiquity, genetically engineered humanity, and established civilization. This vision, though rejected by scholars, captured popular imagination. In this modern retelling, the Anunnaki are no longer shadowy judges or starry powers, but alien overlords, their myths recast as garbled memories of cosmic visitors. The popularity of this theory in books, television documentaries, and online forums demonstrates the enduring adaptability of the Anunnaki. From underworld deities to constellations, from biblical echoes to science fiction myths, they continue to fascinate, their legacy reshaped in every age. What, then, does this legacy tell us? It shows that myths are not static. They migrate, transform, and endure in fragments. The Anunnaki began as a chorus of deities in the Sumerian religion, judges of fate and death. In Babylon, they became stars, arbiters of cosmic order. In Assyria, they legitimized the empire. In Hebrew scripture, they echoed as divine councils and flood narratives. In Greece, they may have resurfaced as judges of the underworld. In apocalyptic literature, they became fallen angels. In Islam, perhaps shadows in the lore of jinn, and in modernity, alien visitors. Each transformation reflects the needs of a new culture, the imagination of a new age. The Anunnaki survive not because their form is fixed, but because their essence, the sense of beings beyond us, arbiters of fate, judges of humankind, speaks to something universal. Today, when people speak of the Anunnaki, they may mean many things: gods of Mesopotamia, symbols in astrology, mythic judges, alien overlords. Yet all these interpretations share a common thread: the sense of a power older than humanity, hidden and enduring, shaping destiny in ways both mysterious and inexorable. In this way, the Anunnaki remain alive, not in temples or sacrifices, not in the whispered curses of Assyrian kings, but in the imagination of cultures that continue to reinterpret them. Their names echo in scripture, myth, folklore, and popular culture. Their shadows linger in every story that seeks to explain humanity's place in the cosmos by reference to powers beyond. To trace the legacy of the Anunnaki is to witness the endurance of myth itself. Empires fall, languages die, civilizations vanish, but stories endure. From the clay tablets of Sumer to the apocalyptic visions of prophets, from the star charts of Babylon to the science fiction of the modern world, the Anunnaki have traveled across time, reshaped but never forgotten. They remind us that myths are not relics of the past. They are living things carried by memory, transformed by imagination, and reborn in every age. And as long as human beings continue to wonder about fate, death, and the powers beyond, the Anunnaki will remain. Silent witnesses, eternal judges, figures whose legacy is written not only in clay, but in the imagination of all who came after. In the conclusion, the Anunnaki have taken on forms as shifting as the rivers of Mesopotamia that once sustained their worshippers. They began as figures of awe and terror in the dawn of civilization, deities invoked in temples and feared as judges in the underworld. They became the stars in Babylonian skies, the arbiters of destiny written across constellations. They marched with Assyrian kings as divine legitimizers of conquest. And even after the fall of their temples, they lived on in echoes, in biblical floods and Greek underworld judges, in the visions of apocalyptic prophets, and finally in the myths of aliens and ancient astronauts told in our own modern age. But what is the lasting significance of the Anunnaki? Why do these shadowy gods, long abandoned in ritual, still exert such fascination? Part of the answer lies in the themes they embodied. The Anunnaki were arbiters of fate. They sat in judgment over both gods and men. They controlled the invisible threads of destiny, the rise and fall of kings, the life and death of ordinary people. In their hands, the Mesopotamians placed the power to determine everything. This concept, that unseen forces govern the course of human life, has never lost its resonance. Whether we name it destiny, fortune, divine will, or cosmic law, the human instinct to explain life's unpredictability through powers beyond us persists. Their second significance lies in their role as guardians of memory. The Anunnaki appear in the earliest written texts. In their myths, we glimpse how the first great cities of the world tried to make sense of existence. To study them is to look into the mind of humanity's earliest civilizations. They are not simply characters in mythology, but reflections of our first attempts to wrestle with mortality, justice, and cosmic order. They are a mirror, showing us what it means to be human at the very beginning of history. Their endurance also teaches us something about myths themselves. Stories do not die when civilizations collapse. They migrate, transform, and survive in fragments. The Anunnaki became watchers, angels, demons, and stars. They were absorbed into Greek myth, biblical narrative, Persian cosmology, Islamic lore, and modern speculation. This mutability is itself the secret of their immortality. The Anunnaki endure because they are adaptable. After all, their essence, beings greater than humanity, shaping our fate, can be recast in endless forms. In this sense, the lasting significance of the Anunnaki lies not only in who they were to the Sumerians, Babylonians, or Assyrians, but in what they became for every culture that followed. They remind us that myths are alive. They evolve with us, change shape as we change, and continue to serve the same purpose, to give meaning to what lies beyond our understanding. And yet, their survival is not only cultural. Strangely and quietly, the Anunnaki live on in us. We are their descendants, not in the literal sense claimed by fringe theorists, but in the truer sense that we inherit the questions they embody. We, too, wonder about fate. We, too, look to the heavens for meaning. We, too, ask whether justice awaits us after death. We, too, imagine powers beyond our world. These are the very questions that gave birth to the Anunnaki thousands of years ago. That is their true significance. They are ancient answers to timeless human questions. And though the names have changed, the questions remain. Today, when we speak of the Anunnaki, we may mean Sumerian gods, biblical echoes, or alien visitors. But in every case, we are really speaking about ourselves, about our fears, our hopes, our longing for order in a world that often seems chaotic. The Anunnaki endure because they embody humanity's eternal search for meaning. Their temples have fallen. Their priests are long gone. But their shadow stretches still across myths, religions, and even the imagination of the modern world. And as long as we continue to ask the questions they once answered, the Anunnaki will never truly vanish. So when you next look up at the stars, the same constellations the Babylonians once believed were the Anunnaki themselves, remember that you are gazing upon one of humanity's oldest stories. The stars have changed little, but the names and the meanings we give them have shifted countless times. And yet, the questions remain the same. Who are we? Why are we here? What forces shape our destiny? The Anunnaki are part of the long chain of human attempts to answer these questions. They stand at the beginning of written history, but they speak still across millennia, reminding us that myths are not just about gods. They are about us. We began among the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, where the Anunnaki were first invoked as judges of heaven and earth. We followed them through the myths of creation and flood, through the rise of empires and the collapse of cities, into the heavens as constellations, and down into the underworld as lords of fate. And in every age, their meaning changed, but their presence never vanished. The Anunnaki are more than ancient gods. They are a mirror of ourselves, our search for order in chaos, our hunger for justice, our awe at the stars. They remind us that civilizations may rise and fall, but the questions they asked endure. And so the story of the Anunnaki continues, not only in the past, but in us, as long as we keep asking the same questions that first brought them into being. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you'd like to see more explorations into the forgotten worlds of the past, stay with the channel, share this story, and keep the conversation alive. The ruins may be silent, but the voices of history are never gone.